Hello, this is the RPG Pundit, the final boss of internet shitlords, and today I'm going to talk to you about a subject in kind of campaign design and game design. This is something that had been on a list somewhere, when I'm not talking about like recent news in the industry, when I'm talking about like subjects about D&D or game design or DMing or things like that, I get a lot of requests. And somebody I think had requested that I make a video about this at some point. And I suppose I just put it off. So I don't know how long ago this was. Maybe it was something that somebody asked about a year ago or something like that, or longer. But this is a good time to do it. So before I start with today's subject, which is going to be about critical hit mechanics, I wanted to make a programming note. Assuming that nothing surprising happens, this Sunday we will be having an episode of inappropriate characters. So be sure to save the date there. I believe it's 8 o'clock Eastern that we start. So keep your Sunday night free and watch our episode of Inappropriate Characters, where me and Ryan and Venger are going to have some interesting conversation, no doubt. I don't know for sure if we're going to have like a guest star or not, or if we're going to talk about themes. If you have a subject that you want us to cover, this is the time to recommend it. Put it in the comments and I'll bring it up with the other two. So there you go. So today I am talking about criticals, and the critical damage mechanics were something that only appeared as kind of peripheral optional rules, some gaming magazines, stuff like that, during the early period of D&D. So in old school D&D, there really wasn't any kind of a critical hit mechanic, though those kind of mechanics started to show up very early on. Like I'm pretty sure there were some in some of the early issue of Dragon magazine, and then of course some of the imitators of D&D started to have those kinds of mechanics. And later on, of course, as a third edition, you ended up having a kind of a very basic critical hit mechanic, which is that, the critical, well, in third edition, I believe you had to do a critical hit would be a natural 20, or in some cases, I think fighters, for example, had like a 19 or 20. And then you had to confirm that with another hit. So if you hit the armor class on a second roll, then you do like double damage. And I believe fifth edition is just, you do double damage on a critical. And in any case, these are quite simplistic sort of mechanics about criticals. Now, there are some gamers that really love having critical hits and critical fumbles, and some gamers that hate both, and some that only like one or the other. And none of that actually should be the deciding factor about whether you use them in your game or not. And now there's kind of two tiers at which we could be talking about this. One is at the level of, are you designing a game? Should it have critical hit mechanics, critical hits, or critical fumbles, which have also been around for a very long time. And the second is, if you're running a game, let's say you're running an OSR game or a D&D game, and you like critical hits, should you, house rule that into your game in some way? And then what should they be? So in the first place, whether or not you like it should not necessarily be it definitely shouldn't be the only factor of whether you use it or not, because you have to think about what critical hits do. So if your mechanic for a critical is going to be the one that's verisimilitudinous, to use a big word, then what that'll mean is that your player characters can do critical hits, and monsters or opponents or whatever could do critical hits on the player characters. And this has an important effect, a couple of important effects. So the first is that it can bring up the lethality of the game. if you're using critical hits. If the critical hit is, let's say, for example, the critical hit is you roll a natural 20, that's a critical. So whatever the critical does, it means that there will now be an opportunity for your player characters to do that and damage monsters. But there's also a chance that any single monster that they fight could do it to them. And so you have to think about whether you want that or not. So obviously in my games, in like Lion and Dragon, and well, in all my other games too, like Star Adventure and Invisible College also has this. Now, those games have it in a slightly different way, which is where the critical does damage directly to Constitution, because in those two games, being a sci-fi and a modern game, what I did is the player characters have hit points, and when their hit points go to 0, then they continue taking damage directly to their con score. And that's like the serious damage. And if they, obviously if they get to 0 con, they die, right? So what a critical hit does there is it bypasses all the hit points, goes directly to con. In Lion and Dragon, and in the upcoming Baptism of Fire, what you have is when you have a critical, you're going to do critical damage that is going to have a special effect based on a table. There's a single basic critical hit table in Lion and Dragon. In the Old School Companion 1, this was expanded. It's also in its own RPG Pundit Presents Advanced Critical Hit Tables. It was expanded into a variety of different types of criticals based on attack type. So instead of a single D20 or a single 20 entry table, you have multiple ones for like blunt weapons, piercing weapons, slashing weapons, monster claws, etc. And so the character will make a critical hit, and then they will roll on the table to see what additional effect that critical hit has. This is very different than a critical mechanic that is simply like, okay, you roll a natural 20, you do double damage. In a number of different ways, because in the first sense, doing double damage on a natural 20 will mean that you do double damage. And that at low level is a very big difference. At higher level, it's less of a difference. At low level, that's enough that a critical hit could end up killing a character, whereas if they hadn't gotten the critical, they won't. At higher levels and against higher level monsters, it becomes significantly less important. It's still a benefit, right? But it doesn't really matter all that much. So what happens there is if you're using that kind of critical mechanic, its significance actually wanes over time. And that's another thing to think about, right? You want to figure out why would you want to have a critical. So the first reason to have critical hits is if you want the characters to be more vulnerable, right? Lion and Dragon is a gritty game compared to most D&D because it's medieval authentic. And so in general, it's more dangerous. And that's how you want it to be in a game of Lion and Dragon. So this is why it makes sense to have criticals to begin with. But secondly, is what are you trying to do this just to make it more dangerous, or are you also trying to do it to create certain other effects? So if your effect is to make low-level play more dangerous, but then it becomes progressively less so, you would use a mechanic like the double damage on a natural 20 setup, because there it'll be more dangerous at the beginning, but as your characters level up, it becomes less and less dangerous to them. On the other hand, if in fact what you want is for it to increase the danger overall and to make it so that criticals become more significant as a potential way to threaten your character when you're higher level and you're then less threatened by ordinary hits, right? Because it's obviously, if you're a first level fighter and you have, 12 hit points, then a double damage critical hit could be pretty bad for you, right? But by the time if you're level 12 and you've got 72 hit points, that's going to be a lot less impressive, right? Unless it's a critical for some creature that does ridiculous amounts of damage. On the other hand, a critical hit that is not actually a mere duplication of damage, but that has dangerous potential effects, like the ones in Lion and Dragon with the table, that means that characters that become, like that 10th or 11th or 12th level character with 70 hit points or whatever, is extremely resistant to ordinary damage. And he can take a lot of hits, but a good natural 20 could take him down. And that is precisely the effect I wanted to create in Lion and Dragon, where it would represent how you had a large number of famous characters, famous warriors in the history of the medieval world, who were taken down by lucky shots, right? Guys that were just absolute badasses, and they die in a really unexpected way because some Kentish peasant had a lucky hit on him, right? That is a thing that you want to reflect if that's the type of game you're running. So if your main goal is to make the game tougher at the beginning of a campaign, to make it scarier for low-level play, then you can do a kind of just doubling damage rule or something like that. On the other hand, if it is your goal to make it more threatening to high-level characters who otherwise are generally less threatened, and to make sure that even at higher levels there's still an element of the risk to mortality in any potential battle, then that's the way to go. The other thing is, do you want to take the time to make a complex system of critical hits or critical fumbles, or do you want to just have something very basic? Because basic is obviously going to be more simple. It's going to take less time in play. It's going to take less time for you to create if you're the one designing it. So rules like on a natural 20, you do double damage, or on a natural 20, you do damage to con. Those are very simple rules, But the problem is that then they're also less regulated, right? There isn't a way. What I mean is that there isn't a way to create a spectrum of risk there. Third edition tried to mitigate that by requiring that any critical had to be confirmed, But at that point, you're also already adding one more layer of complexity to it. On the other hand, if it's your idea to make a kind of something like a critical table, that allows that every critical will do something, but that the span of what it'll do can be very highly variable. So the critical table that is in Lion and Dragon, and the critical tables, which, by the way, in my upcoming Baptism of Fire, I've included all of the critical tables into the main rules of Baptism of Fire. Those have a range that go from 0 to over 21, right? And the way that those work is that when you hit a critical, you then roll on that table. You roll a d20 modified by your charisma. And certain classes, mainly fighters, add their level to a critical. So that means that a fighter scoring a critical is going to be more dangerous than any other class, which is good because that maintains the niche protection of fighters. And critical hits can be as minimal as being something like, you give him a serious cut, add another d4 to your damage, all the way to you've hit the guy right on the throat. He has to do an immediate saving throw versus instant death from decapitation. And even if he succeeds, he takes triple damage, right? Stuff like that. Those are kind of the ranges. And it also means that if you have two high-level opponents fighting each other, and they're both fighters, they're both guys that would add their level to the critical table, that makes criticals even more dangerous. That adds that element of kind of a duel of experts against each other. And on the other hand, if you have a high-level fighter that's fighting a bunch of peasants, well, one of them can still get lucky, right? They can roll a critical and then roll a 19 or a 20 or something like that and leave and either kill your high-level guy or leave him with some kind of bad permanent damage from those tables, which is the other thing that a table benefits, is that it doesn't just have to be, you do double your hit points. Instead, you can say, this is temporarily and or permanently disabled some part of your character. They have to walk with a limp, or they lose the use of an arm, or they had a hand chopped off, or they got a cut in their face that's going to leave penalties social interaction because they look horribly disfigured, all that kind of thing. And that's stuff you can add on as well. It's very important, though, when you do these tables that you have to really think through each of the steps of how much and how the way that you want to progress the damage of them. So if you're doing something like that, it allows for a bigger range. Now there's a lot of instances. Again, when you're the DM and you're deciding how to do the game, there could be a lot of instances where you don't want to use critical tables. If you're running a straightforward kind of fantasy game, if your game isn't meant to be super duper gritty, then you probably don't want to have it, because you also have to remember that when you're using criticals, assuming that the criticals are being done in a verisimilitudious way, in a way that reflects the world, and it's not a kind of a dramatic way. So you could do it in a dramatic way if what you're doing is a game that is meant to emulate high heroic fantasy fiction. You could say, well, player characters do criticals. Nobody else gets to do criticals. Only player characters do that. In which case you've suddenly created something that makes player characters more powerful than anyone else in the world. And so you really have to think, is that the kind of campaign you want it to be? There are cases where it could be, right? Because maybe you're doing this kind of fantasy super heroic campaign. But you need to know that. You need to understand that then that has a reflection in the world, that for some reason your guys are so special that they get to do criticals and no one else does. But if both sides do criticals, remember that most of the times a player character, because it's a random roll, right? So a player character will score a critical against some orc that they probably could have killed anyways. But every single orc has a chance to score a critical against the player character, which will then, have potentially fatal or long-term consequences. So that's what you have to balance out. So you need to know. And so there's this place in the middle between the super high fantasy, super heroic campaign and the gritty campaign. If you're doing a generic fantasy campaign, and I think this is why for a long time D&D did not have a critical mechanic, that it makes sense not to, right? You might want to have a mechanic that just says, well, if you roll a natural 20, you hit no matter what, That's good. To say if you roll a natural 1, you miss no matter what. And I think that's, even though it's not in all of the D&D rules, that is something that I think has been a very, very long-term kind of tradition of D&D, right? That if you roll a 20, you hit, damn it. And if you roll a 1, you miss, it doesn't matter what you do, right? And then you leave it at that, So you have to know what type of game you're running as to whether you're going to apply something or not. And my final note on this subject is to do with critical fumbles, because a lot of people assume, well, if you do critical hits, you also must have critical fumbles. And that's completely wrong, okay? There are games where it can make sense to have critical fumbles. Most of the time, those games are going to be either comedic or they're going to be gonzo, which by its nature is quasi-comedic, even if you're playing it straight. Okay, so Dungeon Crawl Classics has fumbles and criticals. It has critical tables and has a fumble table. And usually the fumble table is very careful to not be too disastrously tough on the player characters. But even there, the effect of a fumble is that it's fun. It makes your characters seem incompetent, right? And that's what always is going to happen with a fumble table. And so it means that, remember, if you have a 1 in 20 chance, if you roll a natural 1, you fumble, then your characters are going to be fumbling 1 out of 20 times on average. And that means that very frequently in the game, your characters will end up looking stupid or having something stupid happen to them. And so if you're using fumbles, you have to take that in mind, right? Because if your game is meant to be heroic or anything other than farcical, you want to be very careful about applying fumbles, which is why Lion and Dragon has criticals, but it doesn't have fumbles. So, a fumble table can be done on purpose to be funny, or you can do it to be less funny and have it more seem like a series of misfortune that might happen to your character. It's not just that they're incompetent or something. But in every case, it's, again, going to be that same rule, right? Yes, monsters might fumble, but usually it matters less that the monsters fumble than the fact that the player characters fumble, because they're the ones that are always around, right? Your monsters come and go, but the player characters will end up suffering the cumulative effect of many fumbles, So from my point of view, usually the only time that having a consistent fumble mechanic in play makes any sense at all is if the game is a little bit for laughs, right? So obviously in the World of the Last Sun campaign, which I run with DCC, we use it and it's funny, right? It's funny the same way that spell misfires are funny and everything else in DCC can be funny. Especially the way I run it in World of the Last Sun, which is a funny world, right? It's a world that is thematic of failure anyways, right? Like that's one of the main themes of World of the Last Sun. It's a world that's failed, So it's got that kind of humor to it. And if you've ever watched Bill the Elf's channel, you can see how much we laugh at the games and at the characters of the game. And it's a brilliant campaign. But I would never use fumbles in a Sword and Caravan campaign. It just doesn't fit. So keep all that in mind. Anyway, I guess that's everything I have to say on this topic. I'm sure I've talked about this sometimes before, maybe in live streams or something, but I guess here you are. Here's a new video on the subject. I think these are important things to keep in mind if you're planning to design a game or if you're planning to run a game, and how these choices affect how the game is run, So again, check out Inappropriate Characters on Sunday, and check out my products, Lion and Dragon and the Old School Companion series from Spectre Press, Heroes and Villains of the Silk Road, which is the latest from Mad Scribe right now. Baptism of Fire is coming. It's just the art. The art is slowing us down. The art and the map. But check out Heroes and Villains of the Silk Road. Excellent product, especially if you're a history buff. And check out the Pundit Files in the Red Room store. Issue 3 of the Pundit Files is now out, and it presents a brand new character class, which is the Song Dynasty Renegade Martial Artist, right? This is the classic, the Song Dynasty was really the dawn of what we today see as the Chinese martial arts, like Kung Fu styles and all of that. To a certain degree, it largely started with one guy, which I talk about in the product. And in the game, it's a brand new class for Lion and Dragon, in the Sword and Caravan setting. But obviously, you can use it in any setting, and you can use it for any OSR game. And there's 4 styles, very different styles from each other, of Song Dynasty martial arts that you can use in the game. So be sure to check that out. As usual, it costs $3.50, and you can only get it at the Red Room. And while you're there, check out the Red Room's products, because they make excellent stuff too, right? So I guess that's everything for today. Hopefully we'll see you on Sunday. Currently smoking, or just finished smoking actually, a Neerup Hawkbill plus Argento Natural.